The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I have to say that, coming to Chicago, you have these expectations of, the scrape of snow shovels and the whir of tires spinning in the slush and looking at people as they're wrapped in their parkas peering out. And all the other unmistakable signs of springtime in Chicago. But this was a surprise. Nice day. Thank you so much. So I want to spend a little time today sort of giving you a backdrop about what is going on in agriculture now, what the lines of battle are, give you some of the structure of the Farm Bill, which is important to understand. And when we describe that structure, there are lots of ways of doing it, but we use money because ultimately it comes down to money. And I want to also start off by saying that I've given this being an academic setting, I thought even another subtitle would be good. So I'm calling it Vilsack's Choice tonight. And that's after this quote that came at the very beginning of the Obama administration, March of 2009. Pretty heady times. Tom Vilsack had recently been sworn in as Secretary of Agriculture. And he asked, if you had $1, where would you put it? Would you give it to a child for more nutritious eating? And the implication here was a child that was really in need of some food. Or would you give it in a direct payment farm subsidy to a high-income farming operation? Which would it be? Now, President Obama's first budget actually answered that question. He was asking it rhetorically at this point. The president had proposed a significant cut in payments to the very largest farm subsidy recipients, some of the most well-heeled and profitable operations in the country who'd been getting farm subsidies in some cases for decades, and who in 2009, as today, were enjoying an unprecedented boom in the prices they were getting for their products and the incomes they were earning. So for him, it was a rhetorical question. So keep that in mind. Hungry kids and nutritious food, high-income farm subsidies, because as we go through the talk and end up back at that question, you'll see how it has turned out a few years later. Now, the American people, it turns out, when they are polled and asked about this, have some pretty definite ideas. When asked by a pollster for the Packard Foundation what they expected out of the Farm Bill, what they really wanted, a large majority said, we hope it produces healthy food. A similarly large majority hoped it would produce clean water. And even on the farm side, and this is a poll, the results on the right-hand side of the screen, this was a poll done by a new organization that's intending to help promote farmers and their interests in every policy debate and also sort of in the culture at large. And this farm group asked, are we on the right track? The standard question you would ask around election time, right direction or wrong track? And even their poll showed that most people either didn't know or kind of thought maybe farm policy in the Farm Bill was on the wrong track. Well, this has been an issue for establishment for conventional agriculture now for some time, and they've decided to do something about it. Not solve the problems like pesticide use, dependence on subsidies, water pollution, and so forth. No, they've decided instead to launch a PR campaign, a $30+ million effort. Here are some headlines when it was launched. Agriculture industry seeks to restore its image. I mean, how exactly do you blow the most trusted and revered occupational brand in the country? I don't know, but they're spending $30 million because they think they have. Big ads for big agriculture. They were going to make significant investments, including television ads that are running now. Farm groups circle wagons for pre-Farm Bill PR push. Again, this is a pretty unusual effort on the part of the farm groups. Dozens of them came together behind this campaign, and they put together a lot of money. But the most interesting thing to me was that they decided that they wanted to put women forward as the face of big agriculture. And when one of our analysts looked into this a little bit, the question on her mind, she comes from a Nebraska farm and has a degree in economics, works at EWG now on ethanol and crop insurance issues. She wanted to know if the groups that were backing this notion of putting women out as the face of big agriculture, if those groups actually involved women in the running of big agriculture. So she looked through the boards of directors to see how many of those members were women. And the results are as follows: not very many. So you can almost understand why the men decided to put women out front. Polling and focus groups told them that would be the smart thing to do. Monsanto's gotten in on the act. Also, this is from their website, they now have an annual Farm Mom of the Year. Now, I want to be very clear that the women that have been put forward, both by that PR campaign and the women on this website, to me look amazing. They know agriculture, they're skilled at representing it, they're passionate about the issue, but it does seem a little bit odd that agriculture has to mount a PR campaign to defend itself, and that they've decided to try and market themselves just like you might market a consumer product. So there's Monsanto's effort. Here are some of the Monsanto contestants during the chemsuit competition. This guy didn't get the memo about putting women out front. This is Mr. Lehner. He's a Nebraska farmer and sorghum producer. He said that regarding federal budget cutting and farm programs, that the best approach for farm groups was to be quiet. It's like talking to your wife or a state trooper. Don't volunteer anything. I probably shouldn't have called attention to that. But I just thought that it made an interesting contrast between that and the PR campaign. I just want to say very quickly, organic agriculture has some great spokespeople too. These are the heads of the 5 major organic agriculture organizations in the United States. So we don't need to hire spokespeople. They're bosses already. So the Farm Bill. I've charted here the number of farms, and the lumps on the graph are farm bills that Congress has taken up. And you can see the faster we lost farms, the more interested Congress got in writing farm legislation. And it has helped some in recent years. There's no question it has slowed the attrition in some sectors of agriculture from people leaving the farm. But let's go to the Farm Bill itself. So it's composed of these slices in broad measure: nutrition, the subsidies themselves to farmers, crop insurance and the crop subsidies, conservation programs, and then everything else that gets squeezed into the smallest slice of all. Now, all of these slices are under pressure now from budget cutters, but as we move forward in the presentation, I think you'll see that some of those slices are much more threatened than others. But let's start with nutrition. The single largest program in the Farm Bill, really the last remaining federal welfare assistance program, is paid for out of legislation enacted as part of the Farm Bill. It is formerly known as the food stamp program. It's called SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. We're an environmental organization, and as was mentioned before, we are very concerned about children's environmental health, toxic chemicals. exposures that might harm children as they're growing up. As an environmental organization, we didn't think it made any sense at all to be concerned about things children might be exposed to in their food and not also be concerned about the fact that they have enough to eat. The Environmental Working Group's top priority in the Farm Bill is protecting the food stamp program, the SNAP program, protecting the benefits to make sure, especially now, that we are taking care of those who are least able to take care of themselves. We are the only national environmental organization that's taken a stand at all on that issue, and it's our #1 priority. So about 70+% of the Farm Bill is actually taken up by the SNAP program. And of course, as the Great Recession hit the economy, the enrollment for the SNAP program just skyrocketed. Over 45 million Americans are currently in the SNAP program. It is brutally means tested. If you're in a household of 3 and you make more than $23,800, you're likely too well off to qualify for this program. The benefits are uniform for everyone, and they're rather meager, about $1.50 per beneficiary per meal per day, $4.50 a day. The average household collects about $300 a month. A substantial majority of those households have workers in them, and even then they qualify and need the food stamp program, the SNAP program, to keep them going. Half of these 45 million Americans are kids in the program. And for many of them, without this program, there simply would be no food at home, meager as it is. And I put this picture up on purpose because it shows a particularly distorted image of who the beneficiaries of the SNAP program really are. The largest single group in the SNAP program is white. African American and Hispanic people make up the other 2 major components of it. But particularly now, when this program is being demonized on the campaign trail, when there are references being made to the food stamp president, as if it was President Obama's idea or anyone's idea that we would find ourselves in such dire straits that we would have to provide for more than 45 million Americans these most minimal benefits. But that is the image, unfortunately, in a lot of people's minds. And I put it up there to remind all of us, it's wrong. Now, we all know, or should know, that food early in life is the definition, in many ways, of your prospects later in life. And when I talk about the school lunch program towards the end of my presentation, I'll underscore this point. Investments in the food stamp program, economists who evaluated the program over the years, in particular evaluated the stimulus package, which added $19 billion over a period of years in additional money to raise the benefits, a modest amount in the SNAP program. They felt it was one of the most cost-effective investments that could be made within all of the stimulus legislation. Why? Because as soon as these families get benefits, they spend them and they ricochet through the economy, adding benefits throughout their communities. But the truth of the matter is, for some of these little people, not being able to get adequate nutrition makes the difference between having a healthy life. It makes a big difference in academic performance, mental aptitude. It makes a big difference in behavioral dimensions of their lives, and on and on. And the richest country in the world owes it to those kids, especially during a downturn caused by Wall Street, to provide that assistance. So that's the biggest chunk. Subsidies. It's actually a little more than $60 billion now. 10% of those recipients over the years have received 74% of the subsidy benefits. Over the years, over 60% of farmers get no subsidies at all. But of those who do, they're concentrated in the hands of the largest farmers in the country. The average payment to a large farm, just the subsidies, not crop insurance, is $30,000. Their average income, this was in 2009, it's gone up, was $180,000. And they were getting these payments then. The average payment to small farmers, about $4,000. Not far off from a food stamp benefit, but it's not means tested in the same way. The average income is about $70,000. Now, we have spent about $250 billion on farm subsidies since 1995. But to suggest that they are anything like a bailout or welfare would be incredibly unfair to bailouts and welfare. After all, bailouts are loans that are repaid, and often they're repaid with a dollop of interest on top. And welfare, as I mentioned in the context of the SNAP program, is pretty stringently means tested, if not brutally means tested. It's time limited. Farm subsidies are limited by forever or when the money runs out. There's a work requirement for able-bodied, or training requirement for able-bodied applicants to the SNAP program. There's no work requirement for farm subsidies. You don't have to farm. You can simply own a farm and have someone else farm it and still get the benefits. And of course, with respect to farm subsidies, not everyone gets the same amount of money as I showed before. The bigger you are, the more you get. The means test, if you have farm income of up to $750,000, there are no limits on the amount of money you can receive. You comply with the payment limits in the program. If you have off-farm income that's equal to $500,000 annually, this is not wealth, but annual income, you can still qualify for the farm subsidy programs. So it's hardly a means test. The program is concentrated amongst 5 crops: corn, wheat, soybeans, rice, and cotton. That's where those crops are grown. And of the 435 members of the House of Representatives, just 22 districts account for half of all that farm subsidy money. And that's both the political problem and the opportunity. But you don't, as I say, have to live in those states or in rural areas. This is a map. We publish on the internet the names and the amounts of money of farm subsidy recipients for every year going back to 1995. These are farm subsidy recipients in Chicago. Here they are in Los Angeles, Dallas, my hometown now, San Francisco, and of course our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. There's some good farming around there. Absentee owners, all of them, and they still continue to get money, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars every year, simply because they happen to own or have a stake in a farm that qualifies for the program. And of course, then there's New York City. I gave a talk at a TEDx conference a few years ago and gave people a little bit different view of Manhattan than they'd had before. These are all the farm subsidy recipients over recent years on the island of Manhattan and beyond. Does that look like a program that's doing what it's supposed to do to you? To be fair, USDA has cracked down on one problem, and they assured Congress via the General Government Accountability Project report a few years back that they are quite certain that very few farm subsidy payments made to dead farmers are being made improperly. The most notorious form of farm subsidy, in my view, is the direct payment. You're probably not going to believe this, but I'm going to give it a try anyway. To qualify for direct payments, you have to own or have an interest in land that has qualified, and that's point one. It doesn't matter if farm prices are sky high or incomes are sky high, as they are right now and have been for 4 or 5 years, setting new records almost every year. You still get the payment. You don't have to show up at the farm. You can stay right there in the middle of Chicago or New York City or Los Angeles or fill in the blank. Practically every zip code in the United States has farm subsidy recipients. And the payments are made pretty much on schedule through direct deposit into farmers' checking accounts. This is where we've come to from a program that was originally in the Great Depression in the 30s, and for many years afterwards, I thought a noble undertaking. It was designed to help struggling farmers who had a chance of making it on the land, give them basically the kind of payment that would allow them to weather the tough times. And sometimes that simply meant just weather their own success of overproduction of crops beyond what the market could bear. And as a consequence, when prices plunged, the government would step in and lend a helping hand. These are automatic payments that are made no matter what. So today, this year, when farming is setting record levels of export sales, record levels of net farm income, like never before, we still sent out almost $5 billion, simply because Congress couldn't get its mind around how to make a change. $5 billion. Remember that number. Now, everyone is saying that these direct payments are dead and gone. The former chairman of the House Agriculture Committee yesterday said that the Environmental Working Group had succeeded in killing direct payments, and now we were probably going to take on something else. And it is true, most observers are saying that this $5 billion is not going to continue. Some of it's going to go back to taxpayers, not a bad idea, and some of it's going to go to other important priorities. But there's something coming along in their place very rapidly. It's called crop insurance, but it's not exactly crop insurance. It's more like revenue insurance that guarantees business income. Now, if you didn't believe how the direct payment program worked, you are probably not going to believe how crop insurance works. But let me give it a try. There are about 1.1 million crop insurance policies in the country. They cover over 100 crops, although 5 of them, and you'll see that in a moment, get most of the money. You and I, all taxpayers, subsidize the premiums, on average about 60% of the cost of the coverage. We pay the insurance companies all the administrative costs for writing the policies and doing all of the underwriting tasks. And then we pay, you and I, all taxpayers, over half of any amount of claim. Billions and billions of dollars each year. I mean, I think it's fair to say that most of those 100 crops, it's everything from tomatoes to wheat to corn, pretty much have better health insurance than a lot of Americans. And it's single-payer coverage at that. Already, crop insurance premiums, which I'm showing in the orange-yellow there, cost more to all of us than the direct payments that are supposedly going to go away. And they're going to increase these premium subsidies in various ways even more. Very few crops. I think the only exception on there is maybe cotton. No, not even cotton. Rice, it's rice, that's right. Rice is the only one where direct payments are still more expensive than crop insurance. So it's no real surprise that there's a lot of interest in the subsidy lobby in moving the whole system towards more crop insurance. What they want to do is actually guarantee up to 95% of farmers' revenues with a taxpayer-supported insurance program that farmers would get for very little money. It would be all the features that I described before, the subsidized premiums. We pay the costs of the insurance companies to write the policies, and we pay over half of all claims directly out of our pockets. And that would guarantee 95% of the Olympic average, the 5-year average, throw out the high, throw out the low, of revenue that those farmers have had in recent years. And of course, those have been the record years. Now, can you imagine any other sector of the economy, in this economy, coming forward with a proposal for an income guarantee that all of us taxpayers would pay for? But in fact, that's the case. Now, I happen to believe that the government has a role in our economic life. Do you believe that too? Well, admit it then. You're liberal. You're just not as liberal as the average Republican member of the House Agriculture Committee. The aggregate costs across all of these policies have exploded when you add all of them up. The subsidy costs, the premiums, the payments to the insurance companies and so forth. And actually that's a little out of date. The new number for 2011, it's going to be over $10 billion in crop insurance payments. And we're looking at adding roughly $3 to $5 billion per year on top of that $10 billion if we have some of the proposals come forward from the subsidy lobby now, that we are, of course, fighting. Now this is a little sort of an eye doctor test. So we're going from this discredited direct payment program, you get the money no matter what, to an insurance program, right? That's the reform. So imagine you're in the doctor's office and you're doing that test where they switch out the lenses. Okay, so tell me, which is better? Is it this or this? You can't decide. I can never decide either. Is it this or this? Yeah. All the money is going to go, the vast majority of it, under the crop insurance program to the same farmers that have received the direct payments. Now, we are unable to track money in the insurance program. There's a provision in the law that prohibits disclosure of who is getting the premium subsidies. But thanks to a friend who's here tonight, who helped the Environmental Working Group in a lot of ways, but I just want to recognize her, Margaret Odell, who was for many years with the Joyce Foundation. And I went to her one day in the early 1990s and said, we want to continue our work on agriculture subsidy reform, but I don't want to hire a scientist to study soil erosion or water quality, and I don't want to hire a lawyer to analyze the laws or amendments, and I don't want to hire a lobbyist. I've got all those. I want to hire a computer programmer to build a database because I want to find out where all this farm subsidy money is going. So we were able, through a series of Freedom of Information Act requests and some favorable court rulings, particularly in a case involving the Huffington Post, that successfully pried person-level data out on farm subsidies. And it's a great court decision to read for anyone with an interest in freedom of the press, the Freedom of Information Act, and the role of civil society in our country. We were able to get payment by payment and built a gigantic database that has generated literally thousands of stories about what's wrong with our farm subsidy system and why we're spending money this way instead of ways that the American people would probably prefer. And as a consequence, we've had a very robust debate. But if we go to this crop insurance route and we don't add transparency back in, we're not going to know who's getting the money. And one of the important foundations for the debate we've had in recent years in farm bills will be gone. Another interesting feature of the crop insurance program is that foreign parent companies own a lot of the companies that issue the policies here in the United States. So you have, Bermuda, Ireland, again with Bermuda, Japan, Canada, oh, those Canadians, Bermuda again, Puerto Rico, they're all getting the money. The Government Accountability Office issued a report just last week that was written up in the New York Times, giving us a little window into the crop insurance program that we didn't really have before, because again, that's a government agency looking into it, not a journalist or a public interest group. And they called out one farm that operated in 2 counties, growing, as I recall, tomatoes, corn, and wheat. And it received over $1.8 million from us just to pay for the premium subsidies on the crop insurance policy. $1.8 million in 1 year. And that same farm, in order to service that policy, to put it in place and service it, we also paid $309,000 just for one policy. How would you like that to work for homeowners that way? Or car insurance, for that matter. The average payment of a premium, the GAO revealed, is about $5,300. So it's going to be the same thing we saw in the crop subsidies. Payments concentrated in the largest operations, often the most profitable operations in the country. Something like 3% of the premium subsidy goes to, 30% of the premium subsidy goes to 3% of the policyholders. Highly concentrated. Now let's go to another slice of this pie. We moved on from nutrition and subsidies to conservation. What does that look like? Well, most people don't know it. But again, thanks to the Joyce Foundation and other supporters, we have worked on this for many years. The single largest investment that the federal government makes each year in conservation on private land comes through the Farm Bill, by far. In fact, it's one of the largest conservation programs in the country, in excess of $5 billion now. And all of that money was put in place, or most of it, in farm bills since 1985, when a group of outsiders, environmentalists, conservationists like me, friends of mine at the Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, the American Farmland Trust, and others, decided that we maybe should weigh in to a farm bill and see if we couldn't shift some of the investment that was being made in the direction of conservation of natural resources and the environment. And there's a good reason for doing it. Agriculture remains the single most important and largest unregulated source of water pollution. It has major impacts on wildlife habitat. Right now, in the upper Midwest, hundreds of thousands of acres are being plowed out that were in grassland and are being converted to corn with new varieties that can take the heat and take the drought. We're losing lots of wildlife habitat. We've lost most of our wetlands to agriculture over the years. So we've put in place these incredibly effective conservation programs. They're not perfect, but they're very effective. And in most of them, farmers share the cost of the conservation practices. In many cases, it's 50-50 for practices on working lands. So the message to me is, if we invested a little bit more there, we could start dealing with even more of these water quality, wildlife, and land conservation problems. The biggest program is the Conservation Reserve Program. We take right now about 30 million acres out of production that otherwise would be used to grow crops. These are 10-year contracts. We're saving 450 million tons, which is a very substantial slug of erosion from the most fragile land in the country, and converting it, in most cases, to very productive wildlife habitat. We've restored millions of acres of wetlands through this program. Stream miles, we've planted trees and perennial grasses along streams all over the country. Need to do more. Incredible accomplishment. This program itself has brought the prairie pothole region, the Central Flyway, and to some considerable degree, the Western Flyway, back from the dead. Millions and millions more waterfowl are in the Midwest and in the Western United States now just because of this program, because before it was all plowed up. No place for them to breed, no place for them to survive. We still have our work cut out. This is a recent photograph of soil erosion in Iowa. And one reason we're not keeping up is we pass these farm bills, and then in the out years afterwards, when there's a lot of pressure to find money in the budget during appropriations measures, they look for ways to cut. And the program that has been the favorite one to cut by appropriators, and that the subsidy lobby has stood by and allowed to happen, because there have been no cuts to the subsidy programs, none, is conservation. So here we have literally billions of dollars taken out of programs that were authorized, that we all were told that Farm Bill signings were highlights of the legislation, only to be pared away year after year after year, while the subsidies go in the opposite direction in many cases. And tens of thousands, I mean 50, 60, 70, 80, 100,000 farmers every year who go to USDA and want to put down 50% of their money for conservation practices, if society will match it, are turned away because there isn't any money. Which is to me, as a lifelong conservationist who went to ag school, whose uncles farmed, I have to tell you, I don't see the conservation ethic any more alive anywhere in any walk of life than it is in farmers. If you ask them what they're doing to protect their land and go out on the land with them, they'll tell you. And if they can't get something done for lack of money, they'll tell you that too. But I don't think anybody's investing more out of their own pocket, certainly any small business, than most farmers are, and they'd be willing to do more, but we're taking that money away. And mostly we're taking it away to protect the commodity programs. This is a photograph taken about a year and a half ago, I think, by the Des Moines Register in Iowa. I would say we could use a little streamside conservation reserve program there, couldn't we? And the last category is everything else. This is the smallest slice of the Farm Bill pie. And to me, this is the slice that's the most exciting and the most tragic, because we are not doing what we need to do to expand some of the very important programs that are funded in this little slice. Some of them are research programs, some of them are very important energy programs for on-farm purposes, rural development, a whole range of things that we ought to be investing in, because rural America is no longer defined by agriculture in most places. It's much more diverse. And we have a lot of great programs that could provide support. But it's squeezed down to a fraction of the Farm Bill total. Let me give you one example of something that's funded in that little sliver. Organic agriculture. Of course, the sector has boomed. It's almost $28 billion now, actually. That chart's a little bit out of date. Incredible. Just a few years ago, you wouldn't have expected to see organic produce in as many supermarkets as it's in now, but on a value basis, it's up above 10% of the produce in this country is organic. Really amazing. Now, it's concentrated in a few crops. You can tell if you go to a major supermarket and you see organic apples, right? You'll see organic broccoli, potatoes, carrots. Some of them are pretty big acreage, pretty big value, and that skews things. It's also skewed because much of organic production of fruits and vegetables, just as is the case with conventional, is in a few states. My home state now of California, over 30% of organic food production comes from there, just like conventional. So if you asked shoppers what they'd like to buy these days, and we've done this in surveys and colleagues have done it, there's a great deal of interest in food that has less pesticide, that they think is healthier for them, but it's expensive. My friend Phil Landrigan describes organic as private school for food. It hurts a little bit, but it's kind of right. It can be expensive and hard to find and hard to afford. But if we invested a little bit more in it, it would probably begin to drive the price down, just like it's done in every other crop sector in agriculture when we've made these investments, but we don't make the investments. In 2004, one cotton farm down south got $2 million in federal farm subsidies. In that same year, that's the amount of money we spent for the entire country's National Organic Agriculture Research Program. One cotton farm, all research on organic. Does that sound about right to you? And here's really the graph that tells the story. We use about 814 or so million acres of land in this country to raise crops and livestock. Pasture, range, cropland. Of that, by the way, only about 14 or 15 million acres is used to grow vegetables, fresh and for processing. Pretty small chunk. And so a $28 billion organic industry, 11+% of the produce, must be pretty impressive, huh? Look at that acreage. You see it? You see it over there? A little bit. See a little slide? Yeah, after all those years, that big industry sits on top of, domestically, of course we import some organic food, 4.7 million acres. Just over half of 1% of our farmland is certified organic. Well, you know, that helps, I think, explain why it's so hard to find for a lot of folks and why it continues to be expensive. And we want to move agriculture in that direction. When you read the advertising, even from pesticide companies, they brag these days about if you buy their product, you use less pesticides. That's one of Monsanto's big selling points. Everyone wants to go in this direction, but the federal government is not helping out. Likewise with farmers markets. This number is a little out of date. It's closer to 7,000 now. A lot of them are in California. We want to see those flourish, but we're not investing in them the way we should. And so the real problem for health in this country, in many respects, is that we have too few farmers markets and too many fast food joints. Why are we not making more investments in that infrastructure? And here, this is a 3-year snapshot my colleague Kari Hammerschlag put together. This is 3 years of Farm Bill spending, a total nationally of just $265 million on all organic, local, and regional food system programs in the whole Farm Bill. Over 3 years, $265 million. In California, it was about 16.7. And the organic share of that is 148 over 3 years. It's more than we've had before, but it's not enough. And I'm not here to say organic is the answer. I'm interested in lots of different alternative approaches to agriculture that help us make it more sustainable. And the ideas are out there and the programs are there to explore them. We're just not funding them. And here's why, really, at the heart of it. People who think like this. This is a quote from an important political figure who said, for whatever reason, people are willing to pay 2 or 3 times as much for something that says organic or local. Far be it from me to understand what that's about, but that's reality. And if people are dumb enough to pay that much, then hallelujah. That was the former then chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, Democrat Collin Peterson. Now, not long after that, he kind of backed off on the statement. And he said, there is a market for organic and there is a market for local foods. I am all for it. I was just in some kind of ornery mood that day. Well, there's a journalist who's observed that in Washington, a gaffe is when people tell the truth. And he was telling the truth with what he first said about organic. And he's not alone. Here's the current chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, Republican Frank Lucas from Oklahoma. And both of these men have done a lot of good things for conservation and even for organic. But the attitude is that organic, sustainable, local, these are niche parts of the agriculture family and should not become the dominant focus of the department's activities. Well, we're really not in danger of that happening anytime soon. Oh, sorry, this wasn't supposed to be in there, but it's such a good chart, I'll show it to you again in another color. And then there's a plethora of programs that would go to the thing that gets my blood boiling, which is helping little kids encounter, experience, savor, and get hooked on fruits and vegetables. This is my friend Chef Ann Cooper with some of the little kids that she's working with. Ann has a simple idea, let's put a salad bar in every school. Some people have said, well, we don't want a salad bar, we can deliver packaged salads. And there's this competition in the produce sector to see who can do the best job of hitting price points that bring either sustainable, conventional, or organic fruits and vegetables to schools. There's a pilot program in the Farm Bill, the school snack program, that gives kids an opportunity to snack in the morning or in the afternoon. Sometimes they leave it out all day on carrot sticks, celery sticks, pears, apples. And the evaluation from USDA indicated that for many of the kids who participated in schools that were in this program, it was the first time they had ever encountered fresh produce. The first time. Now, we could fund for the billions of dollars we've wasted on direct payments and the billions of dollars we've wasted on crop insurance and will waste, we could make a huge dent. We could take this from a modest pilot program to something much more substantial. And we ought to do that. And we actually had an opportunity, which takes me back to Vilsack's choice. You remember the question. If you had $1, where would you put it? Would you give it to kids who are hungry, or would you give it to large, profitable agribusinesses as a subsidy? The opportunity arose in 2010 when Congress had to reauthorize another important piece of legislation that affects what we eat, the school lunch program. President Obama, with the bully pulpit power of Michelle Obama, the first lady behind him, proposed a very substantial increase, not enough that people really felt it was satisfactory, but a substantial increase of $1 billion a year over 10 years to the school lunch program. It wouldn't have solved the problem, but it was a step in the right direction. And a lot of reforms about what could go into school cafeterias, what could go into vending machines and so forth, that would also benefit how kids ate. And we have some serious problems. It's a crisis. Early onset diabetes, heart disease, diet-related cancers, these are all at the top of our healthcare priorities right now. And getting children hooked on healthier eating is the very most logical place to start prevention that's in the public policy realm. So when the president went forth with this proposal, Congress immediately had trouble figuring out where they would come up with the money. They were able to increase the food stamp program during the stimulus bill because that was one of the few cases of a major public policy initiative in recent years that didn't require an offset, a pay-as-you-go feature that would require a cut someplace else to provide the increase in food stamps. As Rahm Emanuel said, never let a good crisis go to waste, and in the stimulus bill, that $19 billion that was added to the food stamp program was taking advantage of a crisis, I think, in a good way. But they didn't have that option in school lunch. They had to find a place to cut if they were going to add $10 billion. Well, the first thing they decided to do was not add $10 billion, but add less than $5 billion over 10 years, $450 million a year, which is about 3 or 4 cents a meal. We serve 30 million kids in the school lunch program. At 100,000 schools, it comes out to a few pennies per meal. But guess where they found the money? Our analysis that we presented to the Senate Agriculture Committee said if you cut the direct payment program and aimed only at the largest beneficiaries, if you cut a little bit of money out of the crop insurance program, cut it out of the companies, didn't charge farmers anymore, you could easily come up with that $1 billion and more if you were bolder. And we wanted Congress to be bolder to get better school lunches in front of kids. But guess where they took the money, where they found the offset? The food stamp program, SNAP. They cut the food stamp program to pay for school lunch, right? The richest country in the world, the politicians decide that what we're going to do is, in order to pay so that kids can have a slightly better lunch at school, we're going to slightly reduce what they're able to eat at home. These same low-income kids that we're so worried about. Now, what's the lesson in all of this? Well, one lesson I think that's not in it is where was the Obama administration? Because the Obama administration didn't speak out, and they were where most political machinery is at a point like this, in the back room counting votes. The real question is, where was the food movement? Where were all of us who are concerned about the direction of our food system and the priorities and how we're spending our money. How we're spending it on protection of the land, how we're spending it on the protection of our very future, our little kids. And the answer is not enough of us were making the phones ring. Not enough of us were sending emails. Not enough of us were darkening the door of these politicians who decided that when it came to Vilsack's choice, they would punt. When it came to Vilsack's choice, they would say what they're forever saying in Washington. It's a hypothetical question, and I don't answer hypothetical questions. And that, of course, makes those their very favorite questions of all. So my message to you tonight is that farm bills are about a choice. It's 1,000 pages of legislation. It's steeped in history. Each program has enormous detail, enormous complexities, and interest groups crowded all around it, making their case. But when you really get right down to it, it's about where we decide to invest the money in the food system every 4 to 5 years. And while I can't promise you that if you pick up the phone, which is the best way to do it, and call your member of Congress or your senators, that it will make a difference. I can't promise you that, but I can promise you this. If you don't, there is every reason to believe that the subsidy lobby is going to have its way again. If you get $2 million as a cotton subsidy recipient, you can afford your own lobbyist. And all the thousands of people milling around farmers markets it doesn't occur to them that they might want to weigh in, they don't have a lobbyist other than themselves. And if you pick up the phone or send an email, it does make a difference. That I can tell you from being a lobbyist in Washington for many, many years. Thank you for your time and your attention. I look forward to the conversation that follows.
If we were to imagine government involvement in an agricultural program that, let's say, met a set of ideal criteria, I can think of 3. Environmental justice, or let's call it nutritional justice, productivity, so that there might be enough food for all of that justice, and environmental responsibility, what would it look like, and how would it change that pie figure that you showed us to begin with?
Well, that's a great question. When it comes to productivity, I think we would certainly be spending more money on agricultural science and research, independent science. So much of the science that is underneath the productivity gains we're seeing now is private science. And while it has a lot of benefits, and we wouldn't want to replicate that, it leaves out a lot of things, like things that you would invest in without the expectation of earning a profit. Things like organic agriculture research, sustainable agriculture research, smarter use of on-farm energy, and on and on. So that piece would go up, and that's all squeezed into that tiny sliver, all the research, right? You would certainly modify our subsidy system. We have a proposal that we're going to be releasing tomorrow where we're suggesting, look, get rid of the direct payments, and instead of all this complex insurance, we could just give farmers 70% insurance coverage free. We'll pay for that. And that would still save us tens of billions of dollars over the course of a farm bill. We wouldn't be guaranteeing their revenue, we'd be guaranteeing their circumstances when times are tough. And we have a detailed 50-page report that's going to be released tomorrow in Washington, D.C. When it comes to food justice, you know, the food stamp program, the SNAP program, is really about people being unable to earn a living. The solutions to that lie outside the Farm Bill, but while we are reliant on these programs to make sure that people can support their families, we have to make sure that we protect that benefit. I think we need to increase dramatically, as I said, the benefits that we provide for kids at school at the same time. This is an expensive proposition. When you start raising benefits, even modestly per person on 45 million people, or 30 million kids in school, you're talking about big numbers. You know what numbers are bigger? The numbers that have to do with the damage that's done when people don't have enough to eat or they eat badly. Health consequences of poor nutrition, school consequences of inability to concentrate, on and on and on. The billions of those costs dwarf the billions that we should be investing in our food system for healthier eating for all of us.
Andrew? Sure. Thank you very much for your talk. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about how the Department of Agriculture plays into sort of creating policy and enacting policy, and sort of how much power does Vilsack have to make substantive choices, and how does that react to the Farm Bill debate?
Great question. Well, you know, when Mr. Vilsack came to town, you got the impression that he thought he would have more power than it turns out he has. I think there are a number of cases where I feel the Obama administration has not stepped up politically to really support some of the policy ideas that they put out there, and they've consistently put out there, like more support for low-income programs, more support for local food, more support for the school lunch program. I feel like they've not really put pedal to the metal on those. And part of that's the Secretary of Vilsack's role, but I think it's an administration function to do that and give him the backing to do it. And time and again, in my opinion, they've stepped back from that. And I think it's particularly unfortunate that when you have a First Lady like Michelle Obama, who's been so incredible on this issue, to not have the full force of the administration behind her where it matters, which is money, is a lost opportunity, because I think people would really respond to it. My first Farm Bill was in 1977, and there were tractors on the mall plowing it up. Because prices were low. Secretary Butts, the former secretary at that time, had advised farmers to plant fence row to feed the world. They did that. They tore out generations of conservation practices, hedges, fence rows that were protected for wildlife. They farmed right up and down gullies, and they overproduced and blew a hole in the farm economy. Prices plunged, incomes plunged. Land prices actually even dipped, a huge foreclosure rate, really a grim period. And farmers were extremely angry and upset about it. And so they drove to Washington on their tractors and literally plowed up the mall in protest. In all of that time, I have seen secretaries of agriculture play important leadership roles. Often they're not submitting legislation, but sometimes they do. And just perhaps to go against type a little bit, or what you think my type might be, I have to say that one of the most aggressive, and I think in many ways progressive, administrations for agriculture policy was the recent Bush administration. When it came down to really putting lobbying clout and emphasis on things, they fought very hard. They vetoed 2 farm bills because they were paying rich farmers too much, they said. And that was really a big part of it. I mean, the president himself, I know for a fact, kept asking, I don't know how this fit with the rest of his ideology, but kept asking his Secretary of Agriculture why we were making all these subsidy payments to rich farmers. And the secretary, who's now in the Senate, Mike Johans, and his predecessor, Ann Veneman from California. They both stood for, I thought, a very exciting new approach to agriculture policy, and the White House stood behind him. I think there's still some time to go. We'll see where Secretary Vilsack can weigh in, but he has said already that he's not focusing on the Farm Bill, that Congress is doing it. It feels a little bit like healthcare reform right now to me. A little too much Congress, a little too little administration pressure on it. He's got power administratively, and he's got the bully pulpit. But like a lot of Democrats in that office, they're always torn, and they're always deciding that they need to, cater to the subsidy lobby in order to win elections. In the last Farm Bill, we, I think, had a very unfortunate consequence where the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, was convinced that in order to save 7 freshman Democrats on the House Agriculture Committee, she should oppose reform and support the committee's bill, First time a Speaker of the House in my memory, going back to Tom Foley, who was from a wheat district, had ever whipped the caucus to support the committee bill, but that's what she did, and she defeated a lot of our reform efforts. The reform pressure helped make the bill better, and she acknowledged that in the very first thing she said on the floor, but it wasn't helpful. And by the way, all 7 of those Democrats are gone. So it's an interesting political dance, but I think the Secretary needs to, I hope he'll play his hand even stronger than he has. He's got a good heart. He means the right thing, I think. He's got all the right intentions. But in order for him to find his voice, he has to make sure he's speaking on behalf of the administration. They really haven't picked this fight in earnest yet. I hope they do.
Well, that leads back to my question, really, because what I was wondering is if you could say a little bit more about the current legislative process and what we can expect, coming up in the future.
Okay, so here's how these farm bills work. And this is, I mean, have you believed anything I've said so far about these policies? I don't know why you would. Each 4 or 5 years, they enact a new farm bill that sits atop sort of fossil law that's been around since the 30s. And they keep that fossil law in place as a threat so that if they don't reauthorize the new farm bill on top, it'll go away and the old law will take effect, and it has all these bizarre impacts on the economy if that happens. And some ag economists are actually paid to figure out what that would be. But it never happens because they use that leverage to get a farm bill. So we're in cycle now to pass a reauthorization this year. And it's a tough year to do it. The farm subsidy lobby has suffered a number of defeats recently, fairly unprecedented. There have been setbacks on ethanol policy. They lost a $5 billion tax break, federal excise tax credit, federal blender's credit, I'm sorry. That's basically a bribe to refineries to put corn ethanol into gasoline. They've had a series of tough votes in the Senate and the House that, in one case, capped payments to millionaire farmers. That was offered by Senator Coburn from Oklahoma. Does Senator Coburn ring a bell? He's not, wouldn't think of him as a progressive reformer exactly. He's a very conservative senator from Oklahoma. Several amendments passed in the House that prohibited the Secretary of Agriculture from using certain funds to invest in changeovers at gas stations so that they could sell more ethanol. This is a subsidy that the gas stations don't want, but the corn ethanol industry wants them to have. But it was, there was a vote taken that discouraged that, and several others. Oh, here's another one. We had a World Trade Organization challenge against our cotton program brought by Brazil and a number of African countries, and Brazil and the African countries won, that showed our cotton subsidies contravened WTO rules. They were basically illegal subsidies in some cases, or improper subsidies. And so instead of getting rid of the subsidies on our side, we decided through negotiations with Brazil that we would pay them $170 million a year in subsidies so that we didn't have to change our subsidies. So I'm really losing you. I know I'm losing you. You're just not believing any of this. Well, that was voted, you know, there was a vote in the House of Representatives to end that too. It didn't carry in the Senate. But so there were lots of warning signs that, that the subsidy lobby was in trouble. So now I think, you know, one thought is that the Tea Party's in power. There's a lot of pressure to cut the budget. Food stamps are in the crosshairs. Crop insurance is in the crosshairs. Direct payments, everyone's saying they're gone. They're completely unsupportable now. But I think there's a lot of interest in the subsidy lobby in getting this bill done this year. And in fairness to all of us, there would be a benefit in getting the bill done so that the food stamp program in particular is protected, plus other things. Because next year, if we go to next year, there will probably be even less money. Plus, they have to do something. They have to at least do an extension to get past this Jurassic Park deadline where the fossil law comes to life and bad things happen in the economy. So they have to do something in 2012 in order to get through 2013. So it's kind of a mess. Next week, the Senate has announced, the Senate Agriculture Committee has announced, Chairman Stabenow from Michigan, Debbie Stabenow has announced she's going to do a markup of the bill next week in the committee, start the markup process, which means write the bill. We'll see it for the first time, I think, publicly. It's been secret until now. We worked to kill a secret bill in December. And then it'll go to the Senate floor, maybe. We don't know. It depends on how the markup goes in the committee. The House looks like a real long shot. There are long knives out for both food stamps and the subsidy programs, and probably for conservation. So it's not clear that the chairman of the Agriculture Committee could deliver a bill to the floor that would remain intact by the time the Tea Party factions and liberal Democrats got a hold of it. So it's one of the messier farm bill scenarios I've seen in my many farm bill scenarios, many years. I wish I could tell you how it's going to turn out. I think it's maybe a 50-50 chance that they'll do something this year. And if they can do it as part of a bigger piece of legislation that insulates the farm bill from amendments, they'll try and do that, because the floor amendments are the ones that they worry about. You get on the Ag Committee to give away farm subsidy money, and you make a deal with food stamps and conservation. But that's basically what gets you on the Ag Committee, is those farm subsidy payments. If it looks like that's going to come apart on the floor of the House and the Senate, that's a big problem. So they try and lock all of that in. And failing that, you put it in a piece of legislation that's hard to amend. Big budget resolution and omnibus, where there's so many deals in there that people feel that they can't offer an amendment for fear that they'll lose something that they care about. So it's going to be an interesting year, and we have, we have a whole group of lobbyists at EWG up there working on the bill every day. They were up there today, sending me emails, telling me how it was going. And it's a mess. It's tough. But that's the short-term outlook.
Yes, I found your presentation very informative.
Thank you.
My question is, do you see any relationship between the farm bill and the growth of what has been labeled food deserts in many urban areas?
That's a very good question. Thank you. You know, I think that falls in the category of lost opportunities. I don't think you could argue that by subsidizing corn, we're causing food deserts. But if we didn't subsidize corn and spent that money otherwise, we might have some very good investment opportunities for us to promote local, sustainable agriculture and some alternative systems that are out there that I find very, very promising, especially getting young people involved, like Food Corps. A couple of my friends started this, it's very exciting enterprise. I think there are just tremendous opportunities for urban agriculture, for young farmers to get them back to the land, and I think for dealing with this problem in big cities all over the country. And it's not just big cities that have food deserts. There's a great film that's coming out I think in November. It's now called Finding North. It's the working title. A friend of mine, Lori Silverbush, was the director and producer. And her, Christy Jacobson's the other mover and shaker behind this film. And it goes right to this question of what's wrong with our food system, that we are so wealthy as a nation, and we have so many people who don't even have access to food, have to take a bus miles and miles and miles, spend half a day just to get to a decent grocery store. It's outrageous. And I think if we put our heads together and had some money to invest, probably in combination with the private sector, we could do a lot about it. But we're not spending the money there. We're spending on things that I think are wasteful.
Hi,
Yes.
and thank you for the talk.
Sure, thank you.
I'm wondering, it's been my experience that when the well-heeled have lobbyists, and then lobbyists have familiar working relationships with politicians, that there's often a couple of key arguments that they persist on using. And that's typically because there's like a core of truth, maybe, wrapped in a bunch of lies, but at least there's some truth to what they're saying, that it has some force. And I'm wondering if you could identify for us a couple of the most effective arguments that the subsidizing lobbyists have been using over the years and continue to use.
Great. Yeah, that's a great one. We have lots of sort of myth versus fact materials on our website at ewg.org that pick apart some of these, because you're right. That's exactly the culture that forms. They find a good talking point. Of course, on our side, we do the same thing, and they use it. So without farm subsidies, we could starve. I mean, we could literally starve. That's one of the talking points. Now, I don't know about you. I think it's fair to say we're pretty dumb in the big city, but we ain't eating cotton yet. So we could at least get rid of the cotton subsidies, I think, and we wouldn't probably starve. We could also make investments in lots of other things. For example, the school lunch program. If we dramatically increased the money we were paying to get fresh fruits and vegetables into the school lunch program, farmers would be growing those crops. It's just not the farmers maybe who prefer to grow corn and wheat and rice and cotton right now. We'd still be supporting the economy. So it's pretty hard to make the case when we export so much, when we are putting 40% of our corn into ethanol. It's pretty hard to make the case when you look at the subsidy lobby that they're that concerned about domestic hunger in the United States and that that's the purpose of the subsidies. Here's another one. If we didn't provide farm subsidies, no one would be farming. People would stop farming, and then small towns would shrivel up, and schools in rural areas would no longer function, and so forth. Well, if you look at census data, you see that despite subsidies, and in fact, perhaps because of them, rural areas are already drying up. These huge investments that we've made in capitalizing agriculture, bringing equipment in to replace labor, bringing capital in to replace management even, in many cases, that has caused entire parts of rural America to thin out. These small towns all over the Midwest are drying up and disappearing. We're also not focused on family farm agriculture when we have a policy in place that rewards you no matter how big you get. I mean, if you can subdivide your farm and create a paper shell that allows you to collect millions and millions of dollars by putting dozens of people on the farm as owners of the farm, various farm businesses, basically evading all payment limits, that's not really a policy that seems to me designed to create more opportunity in production agriculture for those folks. And then the final argument that you hear all the time is, if we stopped farm subsidies, we could become dependent on other countries for our food the way we're dependent on other countries for our oil. I'm just saying. This is one of my favorite arguments, and no one really says it with a straight face very much. They tend to say it on the House floor when they get to give a speech and no one's there much to respond. Let's face it, even if you just look at our oil, where most of it comes from now, the boogeyman that people are trying to invoke is, of course, Middle Eastern oil. And the biggest source of foreign oil for us now is Mexico and Canada, and Venezuela. But even beyond the obvious point, we have an export-driven economy. If we decided, whether it's rice or wheat or soybeans or corn, that we're really, our main concern is to have plenty of that and low prices for it in the domestic setting, all we would have to do is throttle back on exports. But guess what happened the one time that a president, who was Jimmy Carter, decided for political reasons to cut off exports in the name of, in that case, a statement against the Soviet Union, and also to control prices. Nixon did the same thing. Farmers went crazy because we needed those export markets. Our whole economy in agriculture is built on growing those export markets. So I'm left pretty cold also by the argument that if we got rid of farm subsidies, we would no longer be able to feed ourselves. We'd be dependent on a foreign country.
Could you talk a little bit about foreign food aid and where that fits into the whole equation in the Farm Bill? I know there's some pressure campaigns right now to, instead of shipping commodity produce, send money and use that to build up domestic agriculture in less developed countries.
It's a red hot debate. It does divide some of the non-governmental organizations in the sense that Bread for the World and Oxfam, organizations such as that work on farm policy, Their feeling is that we ought to go the direction that European countries have gone, which is to provide cash as a form of aid so that we can benefit producers within regions or within countries where we're providing the aid by allowing people to buy food from local farmers, regional farmers, continental farmers in the case of Africa, what have you, and boost their economy there. What we do now, of course, is we require that almost all of the Food for Peace support and some of the other programs, but Food for Peace in particular, we provide that it must be U.S. grain that's shipped abroad, and it must go on U.S. flag carrier ships. So you end up spending a lot more money per calorie delivered, per benefit delivered, than you would if you provided cash aid. The argument that comes on the other side is that if we didn't have the subsidy lobby behind us by insisting that it be our grain, and if we didn't have shipping companies behind it, because they are required to use our ships, the aid levels would drop off. And some people are unwilling to test that. It's the same argument really in the Farm Bill about the SNAP program, formerly known as food stamps, right? So you have the food stamp program and the subsidy program together, and some people have proposed, well, maybe if we separated those, we would have a cleaner debate, and the subsidy lobby wouldn't be able to put pressure on the food stamp program in order to get what it wants. Well, the flip side of that, of course, is you might not have support from rural members of Congress to provide the level of SNAP benefits that you would like if they weren't getting the quid pro quo of subsidy benefits. My view is the politics on both of those have changed sufficiently that we can probably make reforms happen and keep the levels of benefits at a high, but at the level that we can aspire to. But that's reasonable people differ on that, and that will play out in this next Farm Bill as well. It's part of the authorization. One of the programs that's, I'll just mention, that really is heartbreaking to me that we don't spend more money on is the McGovern-Dole program that basically is a school lunch concept applied abroad, where we provide aid in school settings in developing countries so the kids get a good lunch, a good meal, sometimes like here, just like here, it's the only reliable meal they get on a given day, right? That's true here in Chicago as it would be in major cities throughout the developing world. But we don't put very much money into it. It feels like we ought to be doing a lot more, making those investments with local farmers and helping feed kids in those countries, especially girls. It's so important to have that education. It's the single most important determinant of lots of the positives that come out, not just at the human level, but at the societal and economic levels in developing countries, is how we handle education, and particularly the education of girls, and this is a key tool, but we're not spending enough.
Hi, my question actually happens to follow up on just what you were saying now. So basically it's about 314 billion or 70% of the Farm Bill that's spent on SNAP. So on one hand, that benefits the recipients clearly, and I think, as you mentioned, most people would support that. But on the other hand, it also benefits producers. And my question is, to what extent are there any efforts that these 70% of the Farm Bill benefit alternative producers and alternative systems of producing food? Because one could imagine that there's sort of a multiplier effect, right? If you spend the money on ways of agriculture that sort of are more sustainable, then you could sort of use that money to support the other goals of the Farm Bill as well. And so can you just tell me if you know of any sort of schemes that explicitly aim to do that, or if there's anything that sort of you can think of that would achieve that?
Again, a very good question, and there's a lot of thought and good work being done now, being given to this whole question of whether we're spending that SNAP program money in the best possible way. And it's controversial in some respects, but there are some instruments that are out there that people are, I think, in considerable agreement on, but the question is going to be their reach. For example, some people have proposed, there was a legislator in Florida who proposed prohibiting the purchase of sugary drinks in the food stamp program, just to give you one example. Lots of people, Environmental Working Group included, objected to that idea because we don't feel like it's appropriate to be telling one group of people what they shouldn't be purchasing with a federal benefit. The rejoinder is, well, we don't allow people to purchase tobacco products and certain other things with food stamp benefits. What would be wrong with extending that to sugary drinks? Our view is that the sugary drink issue, the added sugar issue, is a societal issue, and we ought to take that on across the board and not just in the SNAP program. Another approach to that is more palatable but has its own problems, is maybe we should add additional benefits under SNAP for the purchase of healthier foods, fruits and vegetables, for example, which are oftentimes much less affordable, calorie for calorie, than junk food. And we all know the problem. When we've been short on money, you often simply can't afford that beautiful apple or the banana or what have you, but you can afford a couple of bags of chips. And that might get you through a few hours. The idea of adding benefits, I think, has a lot of appeal. Under a couple of circumstances, it would be, I think, near unanimous appeal. One, if it's new money. In other words, if we weren't reducing the benefit from somebody else in order to add more fruits and vegetables to a privileged subset of that of SNAP recipients. And secondly, it's a question of scale. Again, if you're at 45 plus million people, how much can you afford to increase the benefit targeted to fruits and vegetables, which would have the impact you're talking about, right? You would send a demand signal back to the system that more fruits and vegetables should be produced, and as a consequence, you'd help farmers. Makes a lot of sense, but it could be costly. So right now, most of those things, the Double Up Bucks program, and there's another one, I can't remember the name of it, and they're on a pilot basis. Mostly they've been funded by foundations who have added money at farmers markets, and they're experimenting with a few grocery stores now, small chains, so that beneficiaries could go in with their electronic benefit transfer card, and if they have fruits and vegetables, they're able to buy more of that. They basically get double the value of the food stamp benefit for fruits and vegetables. And we'll see how it goes. I think if it shows the promise that it's shown in some of the evaluations I've seen, it's worth looking at. But it's a very tricky proposition to figure out how to do that. And of course, the food companies have been very insistent that, just as in the case of school lunch, they're fighting hard against any kind of restrictions that might reduce the profits that they earn from purchases through the food stamp program by walling off certain types of products. So that's a big lobby to go up against.
Mr. Cook, I appreciate you coming in and talking to us today on the 2024 Farm Bill. Having grown on a family farm, I know it's often not very often that we have time to talk about agriculture and that sort of thing, so I appreciate that. I think you kind of did a poor job of painting how traditional farmers are thinking about the 2024 Farm Bill, especially when it comes to subsidies. I know the farmers I talk to take drought deficits are a serious situation and are really willing to let go of direct payments and see reform subsidies. But at the same time, as you probably know, farming is a very capital-intensive system, a lot of risk that's involved, especially with the way how one day you can have your entire crop hailed out. And so there has to be some type of crop insurance or safety net for farmers. Ideally, how would you have the subsidies reform then to make it so this traditional farming, family farms can be maintained at the same time?
It's a great question. Just like we're the only national environmental group I know of that supports the food stamp program, we're also the only environmental group at any level that I know of that has repeatedly supported disaster relief programs when we've needed them on an ad hoc basis in Congress. You're exactly right. An idea that we're putting out tomorrow is that we ought to provide free coverage of up to 70% for exactly those kind of situations, with an option for farmers to buy up additional coverage for either revenue or crop loss if they want it, and that the government would pay the entire cost of the policy. We think that ought to be limited to $40,000 or so in premiums for any given farming operation, so that we have basically a payment limit. We think it ought to be contingent on playing by certain conservation rules. We have a whole set of rules I didn't talk about now. So when you get a conventional crop subsidy, you're supposed to abide by rules that protect marginal land and wetlands. You can't plow up erodible land, you can't drain wetlands and still get a subsidy. We think that ought to be applied to crop insurance. Right now it isn't, and we'd support that. And you're right, we've heard from rank and file farmers for over 10 years that they don't like this idea of getting these checks when they don't need them. I mean, no one is going to turn them away. You'd be crazy to. But the whole system is driven by the subsidy lobby at the top and is often out of touch. Some of the most creative ideas for reforming the subsidy system have come out of Illinois and Iowa from farm groups. The Farm Bureau, the corn growers, and others have proposed ideas. We don't always agree with them, but they definitely break with the national subsidy lobby leadership. And you see rank and file farmers. I mean, we meet them every day. And you can imagine I meet them almost every day or hear from them every day because I publish the names of all of them and the amount of subsidy money they receive. So we hear a lot. We also hear occasionally from divorce lawyers who wonder about a line of money that the wife hadn't heard about before. But anyway, we feel very strongly there needs to be a safety net. We happen to think crop insurance is a better platform. We still, I think, would like to consider some of the older mechanisms, such as loans, that would kick in so that farmers wouldn't have to worry about the low prices at harvest time. Those can be done for fairly low cost. But boy, you don't see much support for those kinds of things in a lot of the major farm groups today. They've all gone to some version of crop insurance, with the exception of the National Farm Bureau. Farm Bureau has a different proposal, and the cotton growers have a different proposal. So, but I think you raise a very good point. And I don't mean to imply that farmers don't have diverse views on these topics, just because they tend to speak or try to speak with one voice around Farm Bill lobbying. This time it's not been one voice. There's been more discord, more debate. It's been interesting to see. But rank and file farmers are strong conservationists. They spend a lot of their own money on conservation. They don't like government payments, but in many cases they're getting them despite that. We get quite a few inquiries from people asking us what a payment was for, and they're getting it. Because it's so confusing. You look at our database sometime and look at all the payment categories, and people sometimes will call up and they will object and say that they weren't getting a subsidy and we should take that listing off the site. I got a call from a I won't name the chemical company, but it was DuPont. And they called and they objected that we were reporting that they were getting a farm subsidy payment. And these are friends of mine from DuPont who called and said, "What's going on here? You're going to have to take this down. I mean, we've had our differences before, but to smear us with blah blah blah." So we have more detail than we publish on the site. And so I said, "Well, here's what to check," and I gave them all that detail. And they called back in about an hour and said, "Yep, sure enough, a couple of our experimental farms, they had land that qualified for the subsidy program, and they thought it was just good business practice to apply for it."
Thank you for coming to speak to us today. Your presentation was very entertaining and informative. However, I am surprised that you got through the whole thing without mentioning the O word, obesity. The overweight and obesity, 70% of the population is overweight or obese, and the Farm Bill has a lot to do with obesity and overweight and just general health. what needs to happen to fight obesity and overweight is to make healthy foods cheaper and easier and more convenient to consume and prepare than preparing processed and fast foods. Is obesity coming up in the discussions on Capitol Hill?
It is, and I should have mentioned it. I tend to mention the diseases that are related to that as opposed to obesity itself. And so, you know, diabetes often related to that, heart disease of all kinds, diet-related cancers. And people are talking about this a great deal. For the most part, our view at EWG is that this is another one of those problems of what we're not investing in as opposed to what we are. We would love to see more affordable and accessible healthy food, fruits and vegetables, healthier eating patterns, whole grains, less added sugar, all of those things that are contributing to these health problems, including obesity. The trick becomes figuring out causation, and making sure you've really got a link, and then figuring out what you can do about it that makes sense. So let me give you an example. We would grow, we're producing probably 95 million acres worth of corn this year. There's a farmer, right? Record number. I mean, it's an incredible amount of corn. Huge area. Without the subsidy system, maybe without ethanol, without some of the other provisions of law, we'd still be producing 75 or 80 million acres of corn. We're going to grow corn, and we're going to produce corn feed for animals and high fructose corn syrup. Just, that's going to happen, right? With no subsidies. A lot of that's going to happen. And so the question then becomes, all right, if getting rid of the subsidies doesn't raise the cost of high fructose corn syrup in some way that makes it unaffordable, or raise the cost of cane sugar or beet sugar or what have you, in such a way that you change behavior then because people would eat less of it because it was too expensive, you're back to, well, how do we make fruits and vegetables less expensive? And so there the problem becomes that most produce growers don't want subsidies. In fact, they're pretty clear that they don't want to have imposed on them the same kind of system that was imposed on corn, wheat, soybeans, rice, and cotton, or that I should say not imposed on, but that they accepted and participated in developing. So what do you do? And that's where we've continually gone back to the mechanisms that we think make the most sense in this Farm Bill. Now, there are other laws out there that you could fiddle with and worth doing. But in the Farm Bill context, our position has been we ought to make investments that drive demand for fruits and vegetables, and the best one is the school lunch program and the school snack program that's in the Farm Bill now, where you'd by having the government pay for more of those products to be delivered to schools, you'd ramp up supply of it in response to the demand, and we would think that over time the price would start to drop. The prices are starting to drop in real terms for organic already, and other fruits and vegetables that we think would be the same if we raise demand. That to us feels like the best instrument, other than investing in infrastructure that would help farmers outside of the big produce areas like California and Arizona, the West Coast, New Jersey, Michigan, help them solve some of their pest problems, their wholesaling problems, their delivery problems, so that they could make a better living from fruits and vegetables, have a market channel that worked for them, had local demand that they could really latch onto and grow their businesses around. That's been the main argument that we've made in this Farm Bill context. But thank you for your question.
Final question? Oh, just one. This is short. Okay. With Hanson,
Two final questions. Yeah, we're good.
Actually, you kind of crossed a little bit over my question with some of your last response. So thank you. Also, I just
I was curious because I've been really interested in the Farm Bill, and I was curious why fruits and vegetables were sort of labeled like this ornamental crop, and they were, you know.
Yes.
And yet with my plate, you know, in the USDA program, they're so essential. So that I completely don't understand. And
It's goofy.
and then that kind of goes to my more local concern and what we can do. I'm a parent in a Chicago public school. My kids go to a dual language program where it's 65, almost 70% low-income community, and I'm working really hard with a bunch of people to try and change our culture. And you know, the school lunch program really isn't the school lunch program, it's the school food program, because we have breakfast too. So
Yes.
our kids are getting, you know, up to 10 out of 21 of their meals a week at school.
Yes.
So I do feel like, wow, we could make such a big impact if we fed children well at school. But then you go back to the home culture, and I sort of think, like, with your cumulative knowledge and all of the conversations that you've had, what can we do to kind of impact our own communities and work with adults who are actually preparing food in those remaining 12 meals a week to make better choices when there is that argument of, you know, even if you live in a food desert and a market opened up right next door to your home and started selling fresh chicken, you know, calorie for calorie, like you said, you know, read Bittman on like what's a calorie, it's cheaper to buy the convenient stuff and go buy that chicken breast. So how can we influence our cultures, you know, even in our small communities, to change choices? And part of it goes to that whole fruit and vegetable thing, because
Right.
we have that snack program
Uh-huh.
in our school, and it is the first time kids, because we don't get just apples, we get like kiwi,
Yeah, kiwi, yeah.
mango, and interesting fruits,
Yeah.
radishes, things that people haven't seen. So it's a great program, but I just wonder like how that fruit and vegetable my plate thing is so narrow when we're talking about trying to impact our culture to embrace it in a broader way.
Sure. Well, the first thing you mentioned, in the world of agriculture policy, fruits and vegetables are called specialty crops. Is that the weird? I mean, specialty crops, like the things you eat, are specialty. But corn is that's a crop. Now that's a crop. It's so silly, and the silliest thing of all is the people who use the term most reflexively are the people it hurts the most, which are the people who grow specialty crops. So anyway, that's the way it works. I've been in arguments with people for years to call it, you know, we could call it food. Just one idea. I think there are a lot of exciting. A lot of people are thinking the way you're thinking, mom, and community organizer. I mean, a lot of people, at every time I give a talk, someone asks a version of that question, either during the formal Q&A or they come up afterwards, what can I do? And we're starting to put together some resources, but there are some out there already for parents to grab onto. Much better organized. We're not organizers at EWG, but there are some great organizers out there. Food Fight in New York City, I think, is doing some really interesting work. We're publishing something called Good Food on a Tight Budget. We hired a nutritionist at the Environmental Working. See, Margaret, you thought we were crazy on the computer programmer, and now we've hired a nutritionist last summer, and we're putting out Good Food on a Tight Budget that's exploring some of these very issues of how you can find your way to healthier eating with Yes, we are publishing those bilingually, and but here's the thing: it requires cooking, right? Which is also, it's a big part of what the exciting thing that's going on now. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one who's noticed that all the hot chefs are talking about health, and all the great celebrity doctors cook. And so there's this incredible convergence of communities now, and a lot of energy is going into, for everyone from Jamie Oliver, on down. I probably shouldn't say on down, but you know what I mean. He's staked his whole reputation on trying to go into some of these communities and just, shake things up. And I think the tools that are out there are very exciting for organizers. It's very discouraging. I know parents at some of the fanciest, most expensive schools in San Francisco who cannot get what they consider to be decent food served in their school. And it makes them wonder, where could you possibly do it if you can't do it here? And sure enough, you can find examples in rural Alabama where they're doing it. So a lot of it's personality, a lot of it is, salesmanship, a lot of it's ability to lobby. There's a lot of those skills that go on and good organizing that can kind of pick that lock, but it's a tough one. But I've never seen so much energy around that very issue as I'm seeing these days. So we're hoping to contribute in some small way to the groups that are out there doing the leadership role, playing the leadership role. Yes, sir.
Yes, I appreciate your time. Mr. Cook?
Yes, sir.
My name is Will. I got an email from the environmental group that has something to do with the environment. Like, I'm going to tell you this real place. I heard everything about the food. I respect the farmers. I hate to get all that money. Can you just be real basic and tell us about drinking water in plastic bottles?
About what? I'm sorry?
Drinking water in plastic bottles.
Drinking water in plastic bottles. Okay, yeah, I will tell you. I'm drinking. Well, we have a lot of information about plastic bottles and drinking out of them. Here's what we recommend. We have a lot of stuff on our website about this. We're in favor of, and then I'll tell you a funny story about a water company. We're in favor of people shifting to tap water and maybe getting a filter, which can be cheap, and using a reusable bottle as opposed to buying bottled water all the time. Now, if you're someplace where the choice is between buying a bottle of water and a sugary drink, buy the bottled water. And in some places, they're trying to fix this problem by, like in airports and college campuses, maybe here at the university even, filtration spots where you can refill your stainless steel bottle. And we recommend stainless steel as opposed to most plastics. They've gotten rid of BPA. We campaigned on that for a long time. A chemical plastic additive that we're worried about. But we don't know what, in many cases, is in the plastic that they're using to replace it. So we're inclined to support stainless steel. And then here's my funny story, and I can't tell you the name of the company, and this time I really won't, so don't try and trick me. Big company that sold bottled water for many years. Most profitable thing that the company sold. And they made a commitment, and this is bottled water that's, in sort of personal size, and then lots of bottled water deliveries, these big plastic bottles, these big trucks that they made a commitment a few years ago to, when someone from an office building or a school called and said, I'd like bottled water, to discourage them from buying it and instead buy an in situ filtration system that they made a lot less money on than the water deliveries, but that they felt made a lot more sense environmentally. And so this is a message you can take to wherever your workplace is if you have this issue. Instead of having those bottles hauled in and put on top of the cooler, and 1 out of 6 of them, by our experience, is dropped when it's put on the cooler, sometimes on a foot with a great mess. Put a filtration system in, either under the sink or get a separate freestanding one, and then a whole office or a whole school or whatever can begin benefiting from that. You reduce your exposure to some of the chemicals that might be in the plastic bottles when they're heated and cleaned. You reduce the environmental footprint from the litter of individual bottles. You reduce the traffic from the trucks delivering the bottles. It works all around, which is why I respect Culligan so much.
What about a tap? That's it. A tap.
Yeah, we drink at home right now unfiltered tap water where I live in California. When I lived in Maryland, we had a filtration system put in. It was expensive. Tap water's that's a whole other lecture, but we've let our tap water deteriorate so in this country and put water utilities in a real bind because we expect them to clean it up and deliver it and meet all these standards and get rid of all these contaminants. And it's not like they're putting the contaminants in, it's just what's coming through the reservoir in their filtration systems, and they can't afford to filter them more. So, you know, we're stuck with this tap water that's deteriorating. We recommend that you go to the National Tap Water Database, which it turns out when you look it up is the Environmental Working Group, because we had to build it because there was no place to go and look nationally for tap water data. It was most recently published in conjunction with the New York Times. They published our whole database on their website along with us. Go there, find out what's in your water, and then we take you through a series of steps where you can see what filtration, if any, you need to deal with whatever has been found, regulated and unregulated contaminants. A lot of contaminants that are legal, they're just not necessarily safe. And that's the way we recommend it. And then fill up your bottles that way from your filtered tap water if you need a filter. That's the cheapest way to do it. Much cheaper than buying bottled water. All right?
Please join me in thanking Ken.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from the Norman Waite Harris Memorial Fund. Download recordings of other events and learn more about the World Beyond the Headlines series at the Center for International Studies website, cis.uchicago.edu.